January 1944. The winter air in Norfolk carried a salty tang from the sea, mingling with the coal smoke of trains pulling into the station. A whistle shrieked, and a long line of Pullman coaches rolled to a halt. On the platform, American guards braced themselves as the doors creaked open. What emerged was something the townsfolk had never seen before. Hundreds of German soldiers, their faces drawn, uniforms worn thin from years of desert campaigns. They were prisoners of war, fresh from the battlefields of North Africa, stepping onto American soil for the very first time. For the men inside, the shock was even greater. These were not cattle cars, like the ones they themselves had used to transport prisoners in Europe. These were upholstered Pullman coaches, with seats more comfortable than most of them had ever known, and porters in crisp uniforms moving down the aisle with trays of steaming coffee and sandwiches. Reinhold Pell, one of the captured soldiers, would later recall that when a black porter offered food with courtesy, as though they were still human beings rather than defeated enemies, many prisoners forgot their carefully cultivated hatred, if only for a moment. And yet, beneath this civility, their world was crumbling. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a nation in ruins, its cities bombed flat, its people starving, its industry broken. They expected to find desperation, chaos, and weakness. Instead, the train ride across America delivered a revelation that none of them had been prepared for. Sergeant Hans Wacker, a battle-hardened veteran of the Afrika Korps, pressed his hands against the glass window as the countryside blurred past. In Germany, soldiers traveled like cattle boxcars packed tight, the smell of sweat and hay suffocating. Here, he and his comrades had been ordered to sit with space between them, to relax in cushioned seats. It felt like mockery. How could the enemy afford such luxury for prisoners? The answer came slowly, through every passing mile of track. The prisoners stared at endless rows of farmland, fields heavy with corn and wheat, livestock roaming freely, silos brimming with grain. While their families back home queued for meager rations, here was abundance beyond measure. Rolling into the industrial cities of the Midwest, they saw something even more shocking. Factories sprawling for miles, smokestacks roaring with 24-hour production, the sheer scale of which dwarfed anything they had seen in the Reich. Private Wilhelm Krauss scribbled in his diary that night, hunched against the dim light of the barracks lamp. They told us America was collapsing, yet I see no collapse. I see strength, too much strength. If this is how they treat their prisoners, how must they treat their own soldiers? His words, though secret, echoed the uneasy thoughts of many. To understand the prisoners' astonishment, one must look back at what they had left behind. Germany in 1943 was a nation stretched to its limits. The Allied bombing campaign had begun tearing into its industrial heart. Factories in the Ruhr lay in ruins, transport lines severed, and food supplies dwindled to starvation levels. Soldiers were told to endure for the fatherland, to believe in Hitler's promises of final victory. But here, in America, they found the opposite of scarcity. They found power industrial, agricultural, and above all, human. The irony was cruel. The very Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic, over 5,000 produced in only 4 years, had been built by ordinary Americans, men and women working double shifts. Some of those ships were sunk by German U-boats, but enough survived to flood Europe with supplies, and now, with prisoners. The German captives, though unaware at the time, were themselves proof of America's overwhelming capacity. As the train clattered westward, silence settled over the carriages. Some prisoners whispered that it must be a trick, that these towns and factories were staged like film sets, designed to fool them. But as days passed and miles rolled by, denial became impossible. They were not looking at propaganda. They were witnessing reality, an America untouched by bombs, thriving, and more powerful than any of them had dared imagine. It was the first crack in the wall of certainty that Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry had built around their minds, and once a crack forms, it only grows. By the summer of 1943, the illusion of German invincibility had shattered in the deserts of North Africa. Erwin Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps, once feared as the Desert Fox's unstoppable force, had been ground down by relentless Allied pressure. At Tunisia, Over 130,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. A staggering defeat that marked not only the collapse of Hitler's North African campaign, but also the beginning of a very different journey for those captured men. Among them was Corporal Otto Brandt, a farmer's son from Bavaria who had marched proudly beneath the swastika just 2 years earlier. When Allied troops surrounded his unit, he had expected humiliation, perhaps even summary execution. Instead, he was processed with efficiency, and even more jarring, treated with an unexpected degree of fairness. The guards followed the Geneva Convention to the letter, something Otto could scarcely imagine his own army doing in Russia. Still, he braced himself for a bleak future. Surely captivity in America would mean back-breaking labor, starvation, and cruelty. After all, wasn't that what Germany gave to its prisoners? The reality was far more complex. Transported first to makeshift holding camps in Casablanca and Oran, the Germans still clung to the certainty of their own propaganda. They joked about America's supposed weakness, about the soft soldiers who had only triumphed because of British leadership. One officer assured his men that New York City had been reduced to rubble by German bombers. They laughed in derision at the thought of America's factories competing with Germany's war machine. To them, these stories were gospel, repeated endlessly in leaflets and speeches. But every mile of their journey chipped away at those illusions. Crossing the Atlantic on Liberty ships, they stared at the massive cargo holds filled with tanks, trucks, and crates of supplies. The ships themselves were symbols of something they could barely comprehend, an industrial miracle. Where Germany had struggled for years to launch a handful of vessels, America was launching ships daily, sometimes more than one in a single day. The very vessel that carried Otto across the ocean had been assembled in less than 2 months. On board, the irony weighed heavily. The men who had once manned U-boats now realized that even if they sank dozens of these ships, America's vast shipyards could replace them almost instantly. Some prisoners muttered bitterly that the war was already lost, though few dared say it aloud. The greater shock came once they disembarked. For Otto and thousands like him, the American landscape rolled past in scenes of abundance they could not reconcile with their expectations. Towns bustling with life. Children walking to school in clean clothes. Shops filled with goods. Farms bursting with food. In Germany, meat was scarce, bread rationed, and butter a luxury. Here, even the guards' lunches seemed like feasts. Private diaries from the time reveal the bewilderment that spread through the prisoner ranks. One soldier wrote, "We thought America was a land of jazz, movie stars, and decadence. Instead, it is a land of steel, wheat, and energy. If this is their reality, then our leaders have lied to us beyond measure." For the Americans, too, the experience was eye-opening. Young guards from Kansas or Texas, many only a few years older than the prisoners, were suddenly tasked with watching over men who had once terrorized North Africa. Some guards confessed in letters home that they felt uneasy treating enemy soldiers so well. One wrote, "It's strange. We give them the same rations we eat, and some nights I see them laughing, smoking, as though they weren't the enemy at all." This uneasy coexistence would soon evolve into something even more profound. The prisoners were about to discover that America's power was not only in its factories and farms, but in its system, its ability to harness freedom, organization, and human dignity to wage total war. The true revelation began not in the camps, but on the rails. As German prisoners were carried deeper into the American heartland, their eyes glued to the windows, the myth of a broken America crumbled with every passing mile. For men raised on images of bombed-out cities and starving civilians, the sight of untouched skylines and endless abundance was nothing short of disorienting. Sergeant Hans Wacker remembered that first ride vividly. "We expected ruins. Instead, we saw factories larger than any we had imagined, with trains bringing in coal, trucks rolling out tanks, and chimneys spewing smoke day and night. The air smelled of industry, not collapse." To many, it was a first glimpse of what total war meant when fueled by democracy and boundless resources. For the prisoners, the most jarring contrast was not just scale, but comfort. The upholstered Pullman seats, the meals of hot stew, bread, and coffee. These were luxuries few of them had enjoyed even as free men in Germany. In 1943 Berlin, Ordinary citizens queued for hours to buy watery cabbage soup. Here, even guards on modest pay ate meat daily. One prisoner confessed in a letter intercepted by censors, "Captured, I weighed 128 pounds. 2 years later, I weighed 185. In America, even the prisoners grow fat." But this abundance was more than food and comfort. It was psychological warfare of the most subtle kind. Joseph Goebbels had carefully crafted an image of America as decadent and weak, a mongrel nation led by Jews and corrupted by jazz. Yet as the POWs traveled across Kansas wheat fields, through Chicago's smoking industrial valleys, and past Detroit's vast automobile plants now converted into war factories, the propaganda collapsed under the weight of reality. Corporal Otto Brandt, who had grown up watching his father struggle on a small Bavarian farm, stared out at the boundless plains of the Midwest and felt his certainty dissolve. Each acre seemed to mock the shortages back home. Each grain silo rising like a fortress spoke of a nation that not only had enough, but had more than enough to share. He wrote in his diary, "If America is so weak, why do I see nothing but strength?" The shock deepened when the prisoners were put to work. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be assigned labor, so long as it wasn't dangerous or directly tied to combat. Many found themselves in American factories, shoulder to shoulder with civilian workers. Others labored on farms, harvesting wheat or picking cotton. Their German hands suddenly part of America's war effort. At first, many POWs dismissed the work as menial, but soon they began to recognize something extraordinary: the scale, efficiency, and freedom of the American workforce. Assembly lines produced aircraft at rates that seemed fantastical. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was building one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In Germany, by contrast, Allied bombing raids had reduced production to a crawl. A farmer's son from Saxony, working in Iowa fields, marveled not only at the machinery, but at the spirit of the workers. He noted, "The Americans joke with us, even share cigarettes. I do not understand this. We were told they were brutal. Instead, they treat us as men." For the guards and civilians, too, the encounters were revealing. David Rathben, a South Dakota farmer, recalled employing POWs on his land. At first, they strutted about, full of pride. They called us peasants. But after weeks in the sun, working side by side, they stopped boasting. They started asking questions. You could see the doubt growing in their eyes. It was a slow, quiet transformation. Not a sudden conversion, but the steady erosion of lies. America was not weak. It was not decadent. It was powerful, organized, and most dangerous of all. To Nazi ideology, it was prosperous because of freedom, not despite it. By 1944, the transformation of German prisoners was underway, though uneven, and often hidden beneath layers of pride. For many, disbelief lingered. Some prisoners clung desperately to Nazi propaganda, whispering among themselves that the gleaming factories were mere facades, that the war would soon turn with new miracle weapons. Others, however, could no longer deny what they saw each day with their own eyes. Inside the camps, the clash between truth and ideology sometimes turned violent. Hardcore Nazis, especially veterans of the Afrika Korps, who had been captured early in the war, attempted to enforce loyalty through intimidation. They staged kangaroo courts against fellow Germans who showed curiosity about democracy or too much friendliness toward Americans. These trials often ended in beatings or worse. The prisoners called their secret executions the Holy Ghost. At least 3 men were murdered by their comrades for suspected disloyalty. For the first time in U.S. history, enemy POWs were tried and executed on American soil. 14 men hanged for killing their own countrymen behind the wire. Yet for the majority, survival was about adaptation, and adaptation meant learning. American authorities, guided by both the Geneva Convention and a strategic vision for the future, allowed prisoners far more latitude than many expected. They published camp newspapers, staged plays, even organized debate clubs. In some camps, prisoners were permitted to attend classes at nearby universities. Over the course of the war, Germans studied at more than 100 American institutions, learning everything from literature to engineering. It was not an official program of re-education, at least, not at first, but its effects would ripple far beyond the barbed wire. The more subtle lessons came outside the classroom. Former prisoner Theodore Gintz later recalled watching American workers strike because the price of overalls had risen by a few cents. "That was unthinkable to us," he said. "The workers could demand change, and the government did not shoot them. It was only possible in a democracy. For a man raised under the Third Reich, where dissent meant imprisonment or worse, the experience was revolutionary." And then there was the food. For all the talk of industry and ideology, what many prisoners remembered most was eating like kings. American rations were generous, and under Geneva rules, POWs were fed the same as the guards. To a soldier from a starving homeland, it was almost incomprehensible. Letters home, carefully censored but still revealing, spoke of weight gained, of meat eaten daily, of a strength they had not known in years. One wrote, "I fear I will return to Germany too fat for my uniform." Still, contradictions abounded. Some German prisoners noted, with sharp eyes, the hypocrisy of American society. They could eat in restaurants where black Americans were barred. They could ride buses in towns where segregation ruled. To them, it was a paradox, being treated as human beings, even honored enemies, while citizens of America itself were denied the same dignity. Some Nazis used this as fuel, mocking American claims of liberty. Yet for others, the hypocrisy planted a different seed, that democracy was imperfect, flawed, yet still allowed room for change and progress. The psychological shift was gradual but profound. Prisoners who had once mocked American weakness began to wonder if perhaps strength came not from rigid obedience, but from flexibility. If perhaps freedom itself was the engine behind the roaring factories, the endless farms, and the Liberty ships that had carried them across the ocean. By Christmas of 1944, as snow blanketed much of America and the Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe, German prisoners found themselves in an unexpected place, gathered around pianos, singing carols alongside their guards. Some were even invited into American homes for Christmas dinner, sharing turkey and pies with families who had lost sons to the very army these men once served. Around those tables, something quietly radical happened. Enemies became human beings. When the war finally turned decisively against Germany in 1945, the psychological gap between prisoners in America and those still fighting at home became a chasm. In Europe, cities smoldered under relentless Allied bombing. Rail lines were shattered, factories reduced to twisted steel, and families huddled in cellars with empty pantries. But in America, the German prisoners saw a nation not merely surviving but accelerating its output. The numbers were staggering. By war's end, the United States had launched over 5,000 cargo ships, 4 a day at peak production. Aircraft carriers, once counted on one hand, now numbered 124. Factories rolled out 300,000 planes, 100,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 3 million trucks. To a German soldier accustomed to shortages of fuel, ammunition, even boots, the sheer scale of this production was unimaginable. And yet, many of them had seen it firsthand, working in factories that seemed more like cities than buildings, watching aircraft roll off assembly lines like toys from a conveyor belt. For Corporal Otto Brandt, assigned to agricultural labor in the Midwest, the lesson was just as clear in the wheat fields as it was in Detroit's factories. He saw American farmers using tractors, harvesters, and silos on a scale Germany could never match. The abundance was so overwhelming that even the prisoners ate as well as the guards. Otto would later admit to a fellow veteran, "If America can feed its prisoners better than Germany can feed its children, how could we ever have won?" But the revelations went beyond material abundance. German officers accustomed to rigid hierarchy found themselves saluting American officers as equals, not as masters. They observed guards from minority backgrounds, men whom Nazi ideology had taught them to despise, treating them with professionalism and dignity. That contradiction gnawed at them. Some mocked it, others quietly absorbed the lesson. For the Americans, too, the presence of these prisoners revealed uncomfortable truths. Locals whispered about the odd sight of German soldiers enjoying privileges that black citizens could not. In some towns, resentment grew. Why should the enemy be treated better than our own people? The paradox was not lost on the prisoners themselves, who wrote home about it in disbelief. In their eyes, America was both a land of astonishing fairness and glaring hypocrisy. Yet what mattered most was what the prisoners carried home when the war ended. By 1946, the last of the 425,000 German POWs were repatriated. They stepped off trains into a homeland reduced to rubble, cities flattened, families broken. Many wrote that the contrast was unbearable. One artilleryman confessed, "When I set foot on German soil and saw what had happened, I wanted to turn around and go back." Some did. Men who had once worn the Afrika Korps uniform returned as immigrants, building new lives in the country that had held them captive. They opened businesses, raised families, and became citizens. Their bitterness transformed into admiration. But for most, the lesson endured not in relocation, but in memory. They had witnessed firsthand how democracy and capitalism, however flawed, could outproduce, outlast, and ultimately outfight authoritarianism. The seeds of post-war Germany's rebirth had been planted not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the fields of Iowa, the factories of Michigan, and the dining rooms of small American towns. The return of German prisoners in 1946 was not triumphant, but haunted. They came home to a nation unrecognizable rail yards twisted into skeletons of steel, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, and families scattered across a landscape of hunger. For many, stepping onto German soil felt less like coming home, and more like arriving in a graveyard. One former prisoner muttered bitterly, "We returned from paradise to hell." Yet the experiences they carried from America would prove more valuable than any weapon. These men had lived inside a functioning democracy. They had seen its contradictions, yes, but also its resilience. They had eaten food grown by free farmers, worked in factories where workers could strike and still outproduce an empire, and observed guards treating them with dignity, even in captivity. For the first time, they had glimpsed what life might look like without the iron fist of authoritarianism. This was never part of Washington's plan. The Special Projects Division, tasked with re-educating the prisoners, produced mixed results. Pamphlets, lectures, and films rarely broke through hardened Nazi loyalties. But daily life did. The kindness of a farmer's wife, offering extra bread. The shock of watching black and white Americans, though divided by law, still work together in fields and factories. The strange but unforgettable memory of Christmas, 1944. When prisoners and guards sang carols side by side while the Ardennes burned. These moments, repeated thousands of times across the United States, created something stronger than propaganda, lived truth. That truth became the foundation of a rebuilt Germany. Former prisoners returned with skills and knowledge that fueled the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950 seconds. They became mechanics, managers, and engineers, applying lessons learned in American factories. They became fathers who told their children that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom. They became citizens who, having once saluted Hitler, now quietly embraced the values of democracy. The irony was profound. Nazi propaganda had sought to portray America as weak, divided, and decadent. Yet by exposing its prisoners to the very reality they denied, America had unintentionally created a generation of witnesses who understood its greatest weapon was not the B-29, the Sherman tank, or even the atomic bomb. It was the system itself, the messy, argumentative, yet astonishingly productive engine of democracy. The legacy endures in a simple image. In 1943, German soldiers boarded luxurious Pullman coaches expecting humiliation. Instead, they were given coffee and sandwiches, a gesture so small it nearly broke them. By the time they returned to Germany, they carried with them something far larger, the realization that freedom, even with flaws, could build a society stronger than tyranny ever could. The trains that carried them across America did more than transport prisoners. They carried the seeds of a new Germany. And in those journeys, from disbelief to revelation, from enemies to witnesses, lay the quiet triumph that reshaped the post-war world.